Hey, Dr. Nicola here. Welcome to day 2, or part 2 of the down and dirty truths about chronic Lyme disease. Today, I am going to talk to you about a couple of myths of chronic Lyme. One thing that I hear a lot is when people say, "Oh, I've been tested for Lyme. It was negative." That's one part. The second part is, "But I've never had a tick bite." So let's kind of break those two things down. The first one is, I've been tested for Lyme and it was negative. Okay. If that is you, do not be fooled into thinking that that is actually hard truth and facts. And I'll tell you why. The standard testing for Lyme disease is extremely inaccurate. It is not highly sensitive. And in fact, that test was never supposed to be used as diagnostic criteria for Lyme disease. It was meant to be used as surveillance criteria, which is more related to epidemiology. And yet here we are using that test as a diagnostic tool. So the thing about Lyme testing is the first test run is typically an ELISA test, which is an antibody test. It's not highly sensitive. So many people, the majority of people are going to come back negative on the ELISA. Okay. The next step up test is the Western blot. But when these tests are ordered through, big commercial labs like LabCorp and Quest, and or ordered by a doctor that's just kind of like checking the box about testing for Lyme disease, maybe a patient requested it. It's like, okay, fine, and checks the box. But they'll only run the Western blot if the ELISA is positive, and that's called a reflex, right? So if it's an ELISA test reflexed to Western blot, meaning if the ELISA is negative, they won't even go any further. So even the Western blot through those big labs, big commercial labs, is not a really detailed sensitive test, but at least it's one more piece of information. And the ELISA is such a crap test, frankly, that it's just ridiculous that that's what people are getting as diagnostic tools for Lyme. And so many people fall through the cracks. Okay. I've had so many patients, like more than I could count, that have said, yeah, I was tested for Lyme 10 years ago and it was negative. Now, can you imagine if they'd got the right testing then, how the trajectory of their life might have changed? They've just spent an extra 10 years being desperately unwell, right? Because the testing sucks. So that's part one. Part two is when people say, oh, but I've never had a tick bite. So the couple of things I'd comment on that. One is the ticks that transfer Lyme and some of those other nasty bugs are typically the nymph ticks. They are the size of a poppy seed. So it's not that you've got to find this big engorged gross tick on you to have been bitten and potentially transmitted Lyme. They can be tiny little ticks that you wouldn't even see. Okay. Also, ticks like to get into areas that are like warm and moist and fuzzy. So like they'll get into your scalp or under your arms. They don't just sort of like to pop up right here on your hand where you can see it. So having a negative test result, especially from just a non-specific, non-specialist Lyme lab, and or not having knowledge of a tick bite or a bullseye rash, none of those things are actually accurate predictors of whether you have a chronic Lyme disease. Okay. So the trick then is to get the right testing. Well, how do you do that? You go through a lab that specializes in testing for Lyme, and you get as many different types of test as possible. Okay. So I run testing through IGeneX. They are what I would consider gold standard in the world of chronic Lyme disease. They are always improving their tests. In fact, they've just come out with a new upgraded panel that I'll talk about that on a separate video, but it's the best testing, in my opinion, the best testing out there. Okay. Is it expensive? Yes. Is it covered by insurance? Typically not. Medicare will pay for it. Some insurance, private insurance, will reimburse after the fact. But I always tell the majority of my patients, think of it as out of pocket. Like you can't count on getting insurance reimbursement. So IGeneX has these panels where they're looking for a number of different types of markers. They're doing the Western blot. They're running a much higher number of bands than even the LabCorp Western blot would, which just means more information. The more information we can get, the more likely we can make an accurate diagnosis. Now, there's no test for Lyme that's 100% accurate, 100%. There's just not. It's a tricky thing to find, partially because Lyme is immune suppressive. And so we're kind of measuring an immune response to something that suppresses immune response. So it's like inherently flawed. But you want to start with the best you can get. So I would encourage people to use IGeneX. I still think it's the greatest. I think Vibrant Labs has an affordable panel that provides some good information. But if I can get IGeneX out the gate, I will still do that. So please, 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 if you think you might have Lyme and you've been tested by just a sort of regular lab, like a LabCorp, Quest Diagnostics kind of thing, please do not discount that. All right. Please do not take that as gospel that, like, okay, I don't have Lyme, I tested negative. Please dig deeper and get some better testing done and get more accurate information. You know, the joke of the whole thing in terms of the LabCorp testing is I've even had patients who've come to me and said, oh, yeah, I tested positive for Lyme, but my doctor told me that it was a false positive and that I don't have Lyme. I've heard that multiple times, dozens of times. So, I mean, for the love of God, if you have a positive test result on a crappy lab like that, likely means you have Lyme. So again, don't let other practitioners talk you out of it. And I will be addressing that topic in another one of the videos in this series. Okay, so what was the gist of this? If you've had a negative Lyme result through just a commercial lab, an ELISA test, or even they're just a standard Western blots, please don't take that as gospel. Please look for more sensitive, detailed testing. If you've tested positive and been told it was a false positive and that you don't have Lyme, I would call bullshit on that. And I would get yourself to a Lyme literate practitioner. And then the final point was, just because you haven't had a tick bite or a bullseye rash doesn't mean that you don't have Lyme. Those things are not requisites for it. The other point I wanted to add there is that we are now seeing other vectors carrying these pathogens. We're seeing mosquitoes, mites, lice, fleas, things like that. So I've had patients who've been bitten by all different kinds of things and still contracted chronic Lyme. All right, so that's it for today. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.